My name is Tom Coleman, and I'm the executive director of Spectrum Institute. And this interview is a part of the Birds of a Feather project, which is a project we initiated this year to commemorate the founding of the first gay law, 50th anniversary of the founding of the first gay law student associations, the first gay lawyers association, the first time the American Bar Association did a forum on gay rights. And it just seemed fitting to commemorate those activities. But we decided to broaden it to the entire decade of the 1970s. And we've identified 125 trailblazers from that era who were law students or lawyers who were involved in LGBT rights in one way or another while they were in law school or after law school. Many were involved in various forms of civil rights and feminism and so on, even prior to that. With us today, we have Mary Stevens, who's one of those trailblazers. I'm going to ask Mary to introduce herself and tell us about where she went to law school and when.
My name is Mary Stevens, and I went to Rutgers Law School, which I chose because it's a liberal law school. And I started in 1973 and graduated in January of 1977.
You know, from researching you and helping to write up your biography, I learned that your activism didn't start in law school, that you were active in various forms of civil rights and equal rights activities in the 1960s. I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit about the various types of activism, political, legal, organizing, anything that you were involved in the 1960s. Tell us about that.
I had a job at Mass General doing open hearts research, and I saved my pennies. I wasn't earning much, but I saved my pennies because I wanted to take a year off. At the beginning of the summer, I learned about the Freedom Summer Project in Mississippi. Freedom Summer was started really by Bob Moses, who was one of the organizers, and was started because people in the South had been politically active and doing civil rights work, sometimes very dangerous civil rights work, ever since the Rosa Parks refused to go into the Black section on the bus in 1955. And it wasn't making a dent on the national consciousness. And Bob Moses decided that if the sons and daughters of the movers and shakers were in Mississippi, that maybe it would get more attention nationally. And that's exactly what happened. So they got 900 white college students, mostly upper class, from the North to come down to Mississippi in the summer of 1964. And they were engaged in freedom schools. There had not been any education in the South about African history. And also in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Voter Registration. And I was involved in that when I went down in September of 1964. The idea was the activists in the South wanted to have their delegates seated at the Democratic National Convention in 1964 instead of the regular Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has very particular rules that you have to follow. But the regular Democratic Party didn't bother with that. That was a good old boys network. They just held meetings whenever they wanted to, let their friends know. They didn't follow any of the rules. So the idea was that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party would follow all the rules. And then they would petition at the Democratic National Convention for them to be seated instead of the regular Democratic Party. They didn't win at that, but they documented it thoroughly. And they later challenged the people who won the election. And all those records were part of the record that supported the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it was a very important effort. So my job was partly to register voters in the Freedom Democratic Party in the fall, But it was also, they had me on the hotline desk in Jackson. There was a central organization coordinating all the activity in Mississippi. And we had about 24 field offices. I was their hotline. I would call in twice a day to see what they needed, what was going on in their community, any community progress, any voter registration work. And we were also their emergency response. They certainly couldn't call the police if there was a problem. The police was on the side of people harassing them. We were their 911. So we heard about the night riders that would come and shoot up farms or set fire to the crops or missing kids, any emergencies that happened. Those all came through the hotline desk. And that was basically my job there. In December, I decided I had always wanted to go to California, where I had friends from college in Berkeley. So I went out to Berkeley, and everybody in Berkeley was talking about Vietnam. It was in August 1964 that the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened, which brought the United States into the Vietnam War in a big way. And that came as sort of a shock to the country because nobody knew where Vietnam was. What were we doing there? Wasn't it called Indochina? It was a completely new thing. The idea was that we would have teach-ins, weekend events where people would talk about how we got into it, what we were doing, how we should get out of it, all that kind of thing. So I was part of the Vietnam Teach-In Steering Committee with Jerry Rubin, and we organized this thing. It happened in May. It was a 3-day event. It was the largest of the teach-ins. So we had 35,000 people there for 3 days on the Berkeley campus. There's draft card burning. There was a lot of education. We formed something called the Vietnam Day Committee, which was a national organization that coordinated demonstrations and other ways to put pressure on Congress to get out of Vietnam. That's basically what I did. And that came to an end when the event was held in late May of 1965.
At some point, I guess you got involved in the women's movement and women's rights. Tell us about that.
In 1968, I married John Climo, who was at that time a bookstore clerk, but had dropped out of Brown after he got very sick. He dropped out of Brown. We were going to get married, and I wasn't looking forward to being married to a bookstore clerk. So I insisted that he go back to Brown, and he did. And Elizabeth was born in 1970. One of the things that happened, this is what really got us started in the women's movement. John was an artist and a poet. One of his professors, the English professor, held a Thanksgiving dinner for all of us. Edwin was talking about this wonderful poet he had just discovered. She was lyrical, she was brilliant, she had a large body of work. He just couldn't get over how good she was. And he finished up and he said, and she's just a housewife. The other mothers and I looked at each other and we went click. We decided after that, we talked about it, and we decided that we would form the Rhode Island Now chapter, the National Organization for Women. That was a new organization at the time. And I was the first president. Also, we had several members too. We had a judge, we had a lawyer, and we had several politicians in the Now chapter. And they decided they wanted to have a Rhode Island Women's Political Caucus. And then it was 1972, and I ran as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention, pledged to Shirley Chisholm. Before I'd gotten involved in Now, and this is my coming out story, basically, I was involved in La Leche League, which still exists, and it's an NGO, and it is interested in supporting breastfeeding. There are women who find it difficult to breastfeed, and the organization would offer support and help. And one of the things we did was we ran a milk bank. And I was the one who ran the milk bank. So we would collect little plastic bags of milk, and then the people who needed them would pick them up from my apartment. And that I was a very enthusiastic member of that group. It was a little stimulating. Then another thing that happened was that in the Rhode Island Now chapter, there was a woman named Valerie. I got out of the meeting one night and I suddenly realized I was in love with Valerie. And that came as a total shock to me. I just had no conception of anything like this. Valerie was in a committed relationship, so there was no hope there. Later that year, this is now 1972, when I went down to Miami to the Democratic National Convention, and I was out by then as a lesbian, and I was seduced by a very hot fellow attendee. So that's basically how I came out. It was at the Democratic National Convention. I guess I'm bisexual, although I think sexuality is more complicated than we think, because I'm not attracted to men in the same way that I'm attracted to women, but I am attracted to both. So I guess that's bisexual.
Now, if we could fast forward just a little bit to talk about your activism during your law school days, both in law school itself, but anything occurring during those years, politically, legally, anything. Tell us about being an activist, bisexual, on the spectrum of sexuality, law student.
I was encouraged to go to law school by the judge and the lawyer who were the members of NOW. And so I applied to Rutgers because it was a liberal school. So I started in 1973. That year was the second year that the Women's Rights Law Reporter was located in the law school. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg had been the advisor the previous year. She trained everybody. I got very, very good training as an editor. What we would do is we would go through the law reports. Every court publishes its opinions, and those opinions become precedents for other cases. We would read through those law reports every week. I think they came out weekly. We would read through those and look for cases that impacted women's rights in one way or another. That was Rutgers, Newark. And so New York City was the big city. So I went to a few gay bars and met people. And one of them put me in touch with the National Gay Task Force, which was when I was with them for 6 years. That was founded by Bruce Fuller. It was on Fifth Avenue. It is now the National LGBTQ plus Task Force, and it's in DC now. It was more establishment, I think more practical than the Gay Activist Alliance, which was what grew out of the Stonewall Uprising in 1969. There were no lawyers that were willing to help out with the National Gay Task Force. So they took me on as a legal advisor. In my ignorance, I did the best I could for them. And their focus was on things like gays in the military. That was a very big issue. And I did some work on that. Lesbian mothers, employment discrimination, the rights of lovers in hospitals. I mean, if hospital visitors were confined to family, the lover would not be accepted as a visitor to the hospital. And of course, inheritance and housing, and you couldn't marry then. Gee, I couldn't even dance with a girlfriend. I couldn't hold hands on the street. I mean, things are very, very different in those days. And there were lots and lots of issues that the National Gay Task Force got involved in.
Did you publish some type of article
They had a book called Our Right to Love. It was edited by Jenny Vida. And she asked me to put in a couple of articles for them. I put in one, and then one came from a conference I organized. But that was on lesbian mothers. I wrote something on lesbian mothers.
What year was that? Do you remember?
I think the lesbian mothers, I think the book came out in 1976.
Tell us about the Women in the Law conferences.
While we're talking about the National Gay Task Force, though, I should also mention the Gay Rights National Lobby, which is something that they started, or Stephen Dean started, but they were working closely together. And again, for the same reason that they couldn't get any lawyers to advise them, I was on the board of directors for the Gay Rights National Lobby. And they were very interested in the military situation. And one of the things that I came up with was, I think later evolved into the don't ask, don't tell thing. I got the idea that it should be not permitted for anybody in the military to ask whether someone was gay. And if they came by the knowledge in some other way, it was not permitted for them to share that information. So that was to be some protections for gays in the military. They were also interested in employment discrimination, and they evolved into the Human Rights Campaign PAC in 1985, and that is still in existence, and that's in Washington. So then you asked about the National Conference on Women in the Law. There were annual conferences on women in the law, which had been in process for several years. I went to the one in Philadelphia, the 7th National Conference, and they were making plans for the 8th. I should say these law conferences were held at law schools all over the country, and they would be different city each time. So Madison, Wisconsin was the one that won that bid for the 8th National Conference. So I contacted them and I said, gee, you know, what you should have is a full day on lesbian law. And they agreed. So that became what I think is the first full day national conference on gay law. That was tacked on to the beginning of the weekend. It was on the Friday. And we got, I think there were like 3,000 people and we got 1,500, or there were 2,500 people and we got 1,500. So we got a big showing. I was able to get Elaine Noble, who was the first gay state official. She was a Massachusetts representative. Elaine Noble was our keynote speaker. So I was working with Rose Basile, Claudio Frias, and different people in Rutgers Law School, different gay people in Rutgers Law School. And we scrounged around and were able to find panelists for, I think there were 8 or 9 panels that were held on that single day conference. Some of those women were gay, some of them knew each other, some of them didn't. We had panels on all aspects of gay law, which would be lesbian mothers, gays in the military, employment discrimination, inheritance, which was a big thing. So was gay marriage, in the sense that gay couples wanted to duplicate the protections that go automatically to people who are married. In other words, the right to inherit the family home, life insurance policies in favor of each other, arrangements for what if they split up, how is that going to be worked out? That particular panel was called Legal Planning for Loving Partnerships. And that panel became part of the book that I told you about earlier.
That was 1979 in Madison, Wisconsin. And I know that at least—
No, that was 1977, sorry.
Oh, 77, okay, that's right, 77. One of the panelists wasn't a lesbian because I was one of them. I remember. So I was an honorary lesbian for the day, but it was amazing to go there to Madison in such a very progressive, politically progressive city, and to be among all of these energetic, excited people, to be a part of that. And I didn't know that you knew Claudio Frias, but I met Claudio when he participated in the first Gay Rights Summer Project of the National Lawyers Guild in Los Angeles, and I was a lawyer mentor to that project. So that's how I got to know him. Anyway, I'm sure I saw you there at the conference, but I guess it didn't click, but now it's clicked. If we could switch to a personal matter a little bit, I'd like you to tell us about your marriages and having children, and especially raising foster children. I'm just fascinated by what a loving, nurturing, responsible person that you were amidst all of this other activism. There's this soft spot that, of you nurturing all these people, husbands and children and foster children and so on. So tell us about all of that.
My daughter was best friends with a little girl in 4th grade, and for several years thereafter. And so she and her mother, Vera, and I became friends. Vera was best friends with a woman that I came out with, not coming out as a gay person, but coming out as a debutante. And so Julia and I had been debutantes in Albany, New York, and Vera was best friends with Julia. And Vera and I had led sort of ordinary lives. We had jobs, we got married, we did different things. But Julia was totally off on the wrong track. She was addicted to everything under the sun. She was in trouble with the law all over the place, in jail. She married 3 different men of 3 different nationalities and had 3 children. It was like a United Nations. Her family was. And she ended up in jail in Mexico, and Vera helped get her out and helped get her set up in Princeton, New Jersey, where we lived. So Julia came north with her 3 children. Things had not improved. She did not go on the wagon as she had said she would. She was just as addicted as before. She had a violent boyfriend. The boyfriend had a foul temper and attacked one of her children, probably attacked all of them, but one in particular had to be placed in foster care. And that was a boy that we had sort of befriended one of her children, Jared, because we had a farm and we were building a barn. And so we sort of hired Jared. I mean, it was really just a way to get him out of the house. So when this boyfriend attacked Jared and the police were called, they decided he needed to go into foster care. So the question was, wouldn't we take him on? And so we said yes. I mean, what could we do? We weren't going to send him off with strangers. So we took care of Jared for a couple of years. Julia straightened out. She went on the wagon. She eventually became an alcoholism counselor. And when she straightened out, Jared went home. And by that time, we were dealing with the foster care system, which was called DIFUS. And so they asked us, well, gee, we had taken care of Jared. How about this little boy? How about that little boy? So we took care of foster kids for short-term placements. And over the course of about 10 years, we had about 37 different kids for a week, a few months, just sort of short-term placements. Towards the end of that time, around 1992, my daughter was in college by that time, but we were taking care of all these kids and I was starting to get maternal feelings, and I decided I wanted to adopt another child. Charlie and I adopted David, We got them right out of the hospital. We had asked them who was hardest to adopt, and they said Black boys were hardest to place. So that's why we took David. And then when we'd had David for a couple of years, Charlie and I were talking. We said, gee, it'd be kind of nice for David to have a little brother. So we asked them if we could have another little boy. And they sent us Isaiah. And again, that was straight out of the hospital. In fact, that was kind of funny. We told the social worker, we were thinking about this. And 2 weeks later, she showed up with Isaiah. We had no idea. I mean, thank goodness we still had the Moses basket because David was still in the crib, but he also came right out of the hospital, just 5 days old.
Wow. So now let's two last things. And again, you'll have an opportunity to say something else if you feel we missed anything, but tell us a little bit about your life today, where you're living, what you're doing.
Well, I live in Princeton, New Jersey. I'm not doing much really at all in terms of gay rights. I mean, I'm a member of the local Pride organization and I'm in a book club there, but that's all I do. But then I'm a prison pen pal. I work behind the scenes for Move On. I have for 12 years doing things like preparing hosts for events, vetting the events, answering emails that people write into email to Move On.
So you're living your life in Princeton, New Jersey, and you're looking pretty good. I hear you're having a birthday this year.
Oh my gosh. I don't know how it happened, and I didn't do it on purpose. But somehow I'm a whole decade older than I was before.
So you're turning 70 this year?
No, 80. 80. I hate to tell you. I mean, I guess I always thought I was middle-aged, but 80 is old. There's no way around it. 80 is old.
Wow. So the other thing I'd like you to share, if you have any thoughts, feelings, suggestions for the current generation of LGBT law students and lawyers. We've been coasting, with a lot of rights that were gained over the past decade or two or three. A lot of the rights that people have today were forged in the 70s. A lot of young people don't know their history and kind of take it for granted. But now all of a sudden things are being challenged, and maybe maybe there's something that you could say about them living in this time and moving forward based on your experience. Is there something you'd like to share?
Unfortunately, the gay marriage law and other laws hang on the Equal Protection Clause. That's in danger now with Clarence Thomas's opinion in overturning Roe v. Wade. None of these rights are guaranteed. They're all up for grabs. And we're going to have the same fights all over again without any of the legal avenues for protection that we've had in the past. It's time to be very vigilant and very active in securing these rights and expanding the rights that we already do have. It's not a time to sit by idly. It's a time to be politically active. I mean, I'm very active in the Democratic Party. I recruit volunteers. It's time to just dig in and get active.
Well, thank you for those words. And I've got to tell you that I am so delighted to have met you. And I just kind of get goosebumps looking at you and hearing your stories and thinking about just what a fascinating, wonderful, committed, and loving person that you are. And I hope in the future to be able to meet you in person and have a cup of coffee with you or a meal or whatever in Princeton. So, but anyway,
Well, that would be great.
Yeah, so we're going to wind it down now. And is there Is there anything else, or do you think that we've covered things, or anything else that you'd like to share?
Nothing else. I didn't mention that I'm an ESL tutor, volunteer tutor. But I think I covered everything. I mean,
well, you've had a very full life, very active. Mary Stevens, thank you for all that you've done. You truly are a trailblazer.